Do you remember the sound of old hymns drifting through a quiet Sunday morning? Perhaps a grandmother's worn Bible, its pages softened by decades of faithful hands, or the hush that fell over a family gathered in prayer before a simple meal. Today, we journey back to one of America's darkest chapters, the 1930s, a decade when faith was not a luxury or comfort, it was survival. What did it truly mean to believe when your world was crumbling around you? Join us as we discover how Christians found strength, community, and hope when everything else had failed them. When the stock market crashed on that dark October day in 1929, the shockwaves reached far beyond Wall Street. Within months, the tremors shook the very foundations of American Christianity. Churches that had built grand new sanctuaries during the prosperous 20s suddenly found themselves drowning in debt. Collection plates grew lighter each Sunday as unemployment spread like a plague across the nation. By 1933, church giving had dropped by nearly 50% from its peak just 4 years earlier. National income had fallen by more than half, and even the most faithful tithers could only give from what they had remaining. That meant something devastating in practical terms. Missions were recalled from foreign fields where they had labored for years. Ministers were dismissed from pulpits they had served for decades. Church buildings were shuttered and sometimes sold at auction to the highest bidder. Some congregations that had borrowed heavily to construct beautiful new sanctuaries now faced the humiliation of foreclosure. In the optimistic flush of the 20s, many churches had built edifices far too large and expensive for their actual needs. When the Depression struck with full force, they found themselves unable to make the payments. The irony was bitter indeed. Protestant churches supported approximately 340 hospitals across America during these difficult years. They ran 310 homes for the elderly who had nowhere else to turn for care. They maintained 400 institutions for orphaned and abandoned children. All of them saw their funding fall by more than 26% as donations dried up. Staff were released, services were curtailed. Families that had depended on church charity found the help growing thinner with each passing month. Think about what that meant for real people in real communities across this nation. A faithful pastor who had served his flock for 2 decades received notice that the church could no longer afford even his modest salary. He would need to find secular work, if he could find any work at all in those desperate times when millions were unemployed. Young missionaries who had answered the call to foreign fields, who had learned difficult languages and built deep relationships in distant communities, were told to pack their belongings and come home immediately. The money had simply run out. Dreams interrupted, callings suspended, faith tested in ways no seminary training had prepared them for. The initial response from many pulpits was silence, or perhaps denial is the more honest word. Remarkably, in some church journals as late as 1931, you could find no mention that a depression even existed. Ministers hoped that if they projected confidence from the pulpit, prosperity might somehow return on its own. When the situation could no longer be ignored, some turned to old theological explanations. This suffering must be God's judgment on a sinful nation, they preached. Return to his commandments, keep his laws faithfully, and all would certainly be well again. Others blamed the growing influence of socialism and modernism in the churches and in society at large. Few church leaders understood that this catastrophe required something entirely different. Not blame, not denial, but presence, compassion, and perhaps a new humility before the great mystery of human suffering. Meanwhile, in homes across America, faith took on a different texture entirely. Deeper, more essential, more desperately personal. Sunday remained sacred, even when the cupboards held almost nothing at all. Mothers stayed up late on Saturday nights, pressing their children's best clothes, even if those clothes showed careful patches and fraying hems from years of hardware. Fathers polished shoes that had been resoled 3 or 4 times already. The walk or drive to church on Sunday morning was not merely religious obligation or social expectation. It was a declaration that some things mattered more than money ever could. Some things endured when everything else in life had failed completely. Inside those homes, faith was practiced daily in ways that might seem foreign to many modern Americans accustomed to separating religious life from everyday routine. The family Bible often sat in a place of honor on a shelf or small table, sometimes the only book the entire household possessed, besides a farmer's almanac or a worn cookbook. Its pages were worn soft by generations of faithful hands, turning them in search of comfort and guidance through trials of every kind. In the evenings, after whatever meager supper could be managed from garden vegetables and carefully stretched provisions, families gathered around the kitchen table for devotions. Father would open that treasured book and read aloud, while children listened as ancient words filled the small room with something larger than their troubles. Then they would kneel together, every member of the family from oldest to youngest, voices lifted in petition and thanksgiving. The thanksgiving required genuine effort when times were so desperately hard, but they gave it anyway because they believed God heard. Grace before meals took on profound and personal meaning when the meal itself was meager. A pot of beans stretched with extra water, cornbread made with the last of the meal, and no eggs because the chickens had stopped laying. A few vegetables from the backyard garden if they were fortunate enough to have one, and the drought had not destroyed their plants. Every bite became a gift acknowledged with sincere gratitude. Every day of survival represented a small miracle of divine provision that could not be explained by human effort alone. The prayers were not empty ritual performed from habit. They were honest necessity. They were cries for help from people who had exhausted every human resource they possessed and knew they needed something far greater than themselves to survive another week. Women formed the spiritual backbone of countless Depression-era households across the nation in ways that history books often overlook. They organized prayer circles that met weekly in living rooms and church basements, groups of faithful women who lifted each other's burdens to heaven when there was no other place to take them. They quilted together while sharing troubles too heavy to carry alone, needles moving in rhythm with conversation, and sometimes tears of both grief and joy. Their faith was eminently practical and stubbornly persistent through every setback. When there was nothing material left to give, they gave their presence and their prayers and their listening ears. Historians note that women's missionary societies, though formally denied church leadership positions in most denominations, played absolutely vital roles in holding fractured communities together through the long, grinding years of crisis. The radio brought unexpected comfort to isolated Christian families living far from towns and churches. For those who lived miles from any church building, or who simply could not afford the gasoline to travel on Sunday mornings when every penny was precious, radio broadcasts carried sermons and beloved hymns directly into their homes. Families gathered around the crackling speaker on Sunday evenings, listening together as the great voices of faith entered farmhouses and city tenements alike. It was a new kind of worship, shared across vast distances, creating spiritual community that transcended geography and circumstance. Hymns sustained the soul when nothing else seemed able to reach deep enough. Songs like Amazing Grace and What a Friend We Have in Jesus took on fresh power and meaning when sung by people who truly needed amazing grace, who truly needed a friend who would never abandon them, no matter how desperate their circumstances became. In 1929, just as the crash began its terrible work of destruction, a songwriter named Albert Brumley composed a hymn that would become one of the most recorded gospel songs in all of history. He called it "I'll Fly Away." Its promise of release from earthly suffering resonated deeply with a generation that understood suffering from the inside. Some glad morning when this life is over, I'll fly away. Children learned these hymns in Sunday school and sang them throughout the week, the melodies becoming prayers when words failed. As individual families struggled to survive day by day, churches across America faced an impossible and agonizing question. How do you serve others when you can barely survive yourself? The answer, for many faithful congregations, was simply to try, to do something, anything. Church soup kitchens and bread lines appeared in cities large and small across the country, often running on faith and donated vegetables more than any actual budget. In New York City alone, charities and churches served approximately 85,000 meals daily to hungry people who had absolutely nowhere else to turn for help. These were not government programs with reliable funding and professional staff. They were neighbors feeding neighbors, believers serving whoever walked through the door, regardless of denomination or background or ability to ever repay the kindness. The Salvation Army expanded its food depots and emergency shelters to meet the overwhelming and ever-growing need. Local congregations partnered with the Red Cross and other charitable organizations in their communities. Church ladies organized clothing drives throughout their neighborhoods, gathering worn coats and patched trousers to distribute to families who had lost everything they once possessed. The work was exhausting and often felt utterly futile in the face of such massive suffering. The need always exceeded the supply, no matter how hard they worked or how much they personally sacrificed. But stopping was simply unthinkable. For these Depression-era Christians, charity was not optional kindness or extra credit. It was direct obedience to the explicit commands of Christ himself. For Black Americans, the Great Depression brought particular devastation combined with remarkable resilience in the face of doubled hardship. Unemployment rates in Black communities reached nearly 52% in some major cities, roughly double the already catastrophic rate for white workers. Many Black workers faced a brutal reality historians describe as last hired, first fired. Yet through it all, Black churches remained the absolute center of community life, as they had been for generations, stretching back through slavery and its long, painful aftermath. These congregations provided not just spiritual sustenance, but practical survival networks that literally kept families alive. Job leads were shared quietly in church hallways after services ended. Families facing eviction found temporary shelter with fellow church members who had almost nothing themselves but shared it anyway. The church was school, social hall, employment office, and sanctuary all combined in one sacred space. Gospel music flourished during these hard years, its roots deepening in African American churches before spreading its influence across the entire nation. The 1930s witnessed the rise of Thomas Dorsey, who would become known to history as the father of gospel music. After personal tragedy struck his own life with devastating force, taking his wife and newborn son, Dorsey composed a song from the very depths of his grief. He called it "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." The song's raw honesty and desperate reaching faith spoke powerfully to millions of Americans who needed their own hands held through their own particular darkness. Mahalia Jackson, still young and relatively unknown, was beginning the remarkable journey that would eventually make her the undisputed queen of gospel music. The sacred music born in these crucible years would shape American spirituality for generations yet unborn. Tent revivals and camp meetings continued throughout the Depression years, perhaps even intensifying as the economy collapsed further into chaos. In open fields and borrowed vacant lots, under canvas stretched between rough wooden poles, ordinary people gathered together for extraordinary spiritual encounters. The revival tradition persisted stubbornly through the worst of the Depression, offering something that soup lines and bread lines simply could not provide: spiritual renewal, a powerful sense that God was still active in the world, still speaking to his people, still capable of transforming broken lives into something new and beautiful. Evangelists drew crowds of farmers and factory workers who were hungry not for bread alone, but for hope that transcended their immediate circumstances. Here lies one of the Depression's great and puzzling paradoxes. While mainline Protestant denominations struggled and shrank under the crushing weight of the crisis, Pentecostal and evangelical churches experienced significant and measurable growth. Historians who have studied this period note that these so-called sectarian churches somehow knew better how to redeem the difficult times. They emphasized personal conversion over institutional membership. They valued emotional experience of God's immediate presence over theological sophistication and formal education. Their worship was participatory rather than passive, with everyone singing and praying and testifying together as equals before God. For those who had lost almost everything material, the promise of direct encounter with the living God held powerful and immediate appeal. New hymns emerged from the crucible of suffering during these years. In 1930, theologian Harry Emerson Fosdick wrote, "God of Grace and God of Glory," a hymn that would endure and be sung for the next century and beyond in churches of every denomination. The comfortable optimism that had characterized much of Christianity in the 1920s gave way to something more honest, more humble, and perhaps ultimately more true. Sin, faith, and justification through grace alone became relevant theological concepts again after years of neglect. The easy assumption that good people of goodwill would gradually build God's kingdom on earth through friendliness and steady social progress shattered completely against the hard rock of economic catastrophe. In its place came older and harder truths about human frailty and the absolute necessity of divine grace. What remains with us today from those dark and difficult years? The institutions of faith-based charity that still serve communities across America trace their roots directly to Depression-era churches and their improvised ministries. The hymns still sung in country churches and grand cathedrals alike carry echoes of that era's honest wrestling with suffering and hope. The stories passed down through families about grandparents or great-grandparents who kept believing when belief cost everything they had continue to inspire new generations facing their own trials. And perhaps most importantly, we inherit a template for spiritual resilience that speaks to any age and any circumstance. Do you remember the faith of your own grandparents or great-grandparents? The prayers they prayed each evening, the hymns they sang on Sunday mornings, the quiet trust that carried them through when the future seemed impossibly dark. We would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Let their legacy continue through your memory. Thank you for watching. If these forgotten stories moved you, please subscribe and share so others can discover this history too.